The morning Sera found out her best friend had been sleeping with her fiancé for 8 months. She was standing in a bridal boutique in downtown Toronto, holding a glass of complimentary champagne she hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to spill on the sample gown. The seamstress had pins in her mouth. The consultant was scrolling through her tablet looking for the right veil, and Sera's phone was buzzing against her hip, over and over, with messages from a number she didn't recognize. Photos, timestamps, a hotel name she knew because she and Daniel had stayed there for their 2nd anniversary. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the champagne. She handed the glass back to the consultant very carefully, said she needed a moment, walked into the changing room, locked the door, sat down on the little velvet bench, and read every single message. 8 months. The hotel. The texts between them. A voice note from Priya. Her Priya, maid of honor Priya, the woman who had driven Sera to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when she had appendicitis. The woman who had the spare key to her apartment. A voice note that started with "I can't keep doing this to her" and ended with "I know, but she'll never find out." Sera sat on that bench for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she counted. She had always been good with numbers. It was the one thing people said about her that was actually true, and not just a polite reduction of something complicated. "Oh, Sera's good with numbers." As if that were a personality. She walked back out. The seamstress was still waiting. The veil options were on the counter. "I'm going to need to reschedule," Sera said. Family emergency. She took the subway home. She packed Daniel's things into 2 IKEA bags, the big blue ones, and left them outside the apartment door. She changed the lock. She called the caterer, the florist, the venue coordinator, and the photographer, in that order, and she left messages for all 4 because none of them picked up on a Tuesday afternoon. Then she called her mother, who said, "I told you something was off about that man," in a tone that was supposed to be comfort, but landed like a verdict. She didn't call Priya. She sat on her kitchen floor for a while. Not crying, just sitting. The linoleum was cold and the refrigerator was making that hum it always made, and the wedding binder she'd spent 4 months putting together was on the table above her head, and she thought, "I have nowhere to be." That was the part that was the strangest. Not the betrayal, not the grief, though those were there too, sitting heavy in her chest like something swallowed wrong, but the sudden blankness of the calendar. Every weekend for the next 3 months had been accounted for. Dress fitting, rehearsal dinner, honeymoon planning, engagement photos, and now nothing. She ended up at a bar. Not the kind of bar she usually went to. Not a patio place with fairy lights and a wine list. She'd just walked north from the subway station until her feet hurt and ducked into the first place that had the lights low enough that no one would look at her too closely. It was a Tuesday. The place was almost empty. Dark wood, leather booths, a bartender who nodded at her once and didn't ask any questions. She ordered rye, neat. She didn't usually drink rye. She didn't know why she ordered it. It tasted like the inside of a cedar closet, and she drank it anyway. She was on her 2nd when the men came in, not loud. That was the first thing she noticed. When a group of men like that walked into a room, she had always assumed they would be loud. Big voices, laughter, taking up space in the obvious way. These ones weren't. They moved quietly and they took the corner booth, and the bartender's expression shifted in a way that Sera couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, recognition, the kind of attention you paid to something you had learned to be careful around. She wasn't paying attention to any of this, not really. She was staring at the grain of the bar counter and doing what she did when she needed to not think. Adding. The number of rivets in the bar rail, the ceiling tiles, the bottles behind the bar, organized by height, and she was calculating the square footage of the shelving unit when someone sat down beside her. She didn't look up. "You're in my seat," the man said. His voice was low, not threatening. Just a statement of fact. Sera looked up then. He was tall. Dark suit, no tie, a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed slightly wrong. A scar that ran from just below his left eye to the corner of his mouth, pale and old. His eyes were grey, and they were looking at her the way people looked at a number that didn't add up. She looked back at the bar. There are 12 other seats, she said. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, fair. He didn't leave, but he took the stool one down from her, which she thought was a reasonable compromise given the circumstances. The bartender appeared immediately, set a glass in front of him without being asked, and disappeared again. She could feel his people watching from the booth. She didn't look at them. "Bad day?" he said. "Why would you assume it's bad? You're drinking rye alone on a Tuesday, and you've been staring at the shelving unit for 10 minutes. I was counting the bottles." Another pause. "Why? Because I count things when I need to not think. It works better than most other methods." She picked up her glass. "And yes, bad day. Do you want to talk about it?" "No," she said immediately. Then, after a moment, "My best friend has been sleeping with my fiancé. I found out today. I was in a wedding dress when I found out, which is a detail I feel like the universe put in specifically for comedic effect." She hadn't meant to say any of that. The rye, probably. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. People always said they were sorry, as if it were their fault, as if the word could do anything useful. "What will you do?" he said instead. "I've already done it. Changed the locks. Cancelled the vendors. Called my mother, which I now regret." She set her glass down. "Now I'm drinking rye, which I also regret, but slightly less." The faintest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe. "Ivo Rask," he said. She glanced at him. Sera Voss. Then, because she'd been raised to be suspicious of men who introduced themselves in bars. Should I know that name? The look he gave her was genuinely hard to read. Probably not. She found out later, when she got home and searched it because she couldn't sleep, that Ivo Rask was not a name you said in certain parts of the city without lowering your voice first. 3 businesses. Rumors about half a dozen more that didn't appear on any registry. 2 brothers who handled things. A lawyer who had apparently once walked into a police precinct and walked back out with a client they'd been holding for 72 hours. She found a photo from a charity gala 7 years ago. Him in a suit, standing slightly apart from everyone else, looking at something off camera with the same expression she'd seen in the bar, measuring. She should have been more alarmed. She knew that, in retrospect. But at the time, in the bar, he'd just been a man with a scar who didn't say he was sorry and asked a sensible question. Given the day she'd had, that was enough. She was putting on her coat to leave when it happened. One of the men from the booth appeared at her elbow. Young, wide-shouldered, the kind of blank professional expression that told her he'd practiced it. He set a folded piece of paper on the bar in front of her. "Mr. Rask would like to extend an invitation," the man said. Sera stared at the paper. She'd invitation to what? His firm is hosting a private dinner Thursday evening. "There's a car service attached. I don't know him. He's aware of that." She looked over at the booth. Rask was watching. He nodded once, not a command, not a request, just an acknowledgement that he knew this was unusual and wasn't pretending otherwise. Sera picked up the paper, unfolded it, read the address. Then she folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll think about it," she said. She went, of course. Not because she was reckless, no, she wasn't, but because she had a week of empty calendar and a bad habit of making decisions with her hands when her brain was too tired to argue. She looked up the address before she got in the car. She texted it to her colleague Bertrice with the message, "If I die, start here," which Bertrice responded to with a thumbs up and no further questions, which was why Sera valued Bertrice. The dinner was not what she expected. She had expected something performative, something loud in a quiet way, if that made sense, the kind of wealth that announced itself through restraint, marble and low lighting, and people who didn't speak above a murmur. It was actually more like a working meeting that happened to have very good food. 8 people around a long table, and they were talking, not performing. Numbers, routes, a property deal that had apparently stalled at the municipal level. Sera sat next to a woman named Odette, who managed logistics for something she described only as distribution, and who asked Sera 20 minutes in what she did. "Bookkeeping," Sera said. "I run accounts for 3 small businesses, and I was going to get married next month, but that fell through." Odette nodded. "Rask mentioned you were good with numbers." Sera set her fork down. She looked across the table at Rask, who was listening to something the man on his left was saying and not looking at her. "When did he say that?" "Before tonight," Odette said mildly and picked up her wine. After dinner, when the others had drifted into a side room, Rask stopped beside her chair. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said, "if you have a moment." She had approximately 47 free moments. Her whole life was free moments right now. He sat across from her, and he did what she was beginning to understand was characteristic. He said the thing directly, without softening it, and waited for her to respond. "I need someone who can manage accounts that don't appear in any public record," he said. "Clean work. No errors. Absolute discretion." He paused. "You come from nothing. You're not connected to any of the families. You have no reason to trust me and every reason to say no. I'm offering you a position because I think you're precise, and I think you don't get rattled." Sera was quiet for a moment. "You watched me for 20 minutes in a bar," she said. "Yes, and from that you think I'm precise. You counted the bottles," he said, "and when the bartender moved 2 of them, you noticed immediately. You recounted the section. She hadn't realized it was obvious. "What exactly do you do?" she said. "Actually." He looked at her steadily. "Things that are outside the law. I would prefer not to specify further until you decide whether you're interested. You're remarkably honest about being dishonest. There's no point in being otherwise with someone who will figure it out eventually anyway." She should have walked out. She knew that. She looked at this man across the table. The scar, the expensive suit, the grey eyes that had a quality she could only describe as already knowing the outcome. And she thought about the IKEA bags on the landing, the empty calendar, the catering deposit she couldn't get back. The way her mother had said, "I told you something was off," as if Sera's heartbreak were a lesson she ought to have anticipated. "I want to see the books first," she said. "Whatever records you have. I'll tell you in 48 hours whether I can work with them." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, something quieter. "Done," he said. She spent 48 hours with the records, which were a mess, not deliberately obscured, just layered, accumulated over years by 3 different people, with 3 different systems, like a sentence translated twice and then back again. She reorganized them. She flagged 4 discrepancies she found by accident that no one had caught, 2 of which were significant. She sent him a summary document. No cover note, just the document. He called her within the hour. "You found the Meridian problem," he said. "Someone's been skimming from the hospitality accounts for at least 14 months, she said. "I can tell you the amount. I can't tell you who without access to the payment logs." A pause. "Can you start Monday?" She could. The work was not glamorous. It was exactly what it sounded like. Bookkeeping, account management, cross-referencing, finding where numbers didn't balance and tracing them back to where they'd gone wrong. The difference was the subject matter, and the fact that she could not mention it to anyone. And the fact that the men who came and went through Rask's offices looked at her once with assessment, and then, after the first week, ignored her entirely in the easy way of people who've decided you're furniture. Rask himself did not treat her like furniture. He was precise in his communication. He asked questions and waited for the full answer. He did not explain things she hadn't asked him to explain. When she flagged a problem, he listened, asked exactly 2 or 3 follow-up questions, and made a decision. She had worked for 3 small business owners in her previous life, and all 3 of them had the habit of explaining back to her what she had just explained to them, slightly wrongly. Rask did not do this. She was not. She reminded herself regularly, here to find him admirable. She was here because she needed the money, and because the work engaged the part of her brain that didn't know how to rest. She'd been there 3 weeks when Daniel called. She was at her desk. She had a desk now, in a back office, shared with nobody, and her phone screen lit up with his name, which she hadn't deleted yet because she kept forgetting, and she stared at it for the entire length of 1 ring, and then declined it. He called again. She declined it again. The 3rd time, she answered. "I know I have no right to call," he started. "Correct," she said. "Is this about the deposit on the venue?" Because I've been in contact with the coordinator and you're not entitled to. It's not about the deposit, he said. Priya and I. It's not. He stopped. I wanted to explain. You slept with my best friend for 8 months, Sera said. There isn't an explanation that rearranges that into something that makes sense. I'm at work. Don't call this number again. She hung up. She sat for a moment, her hand flat on the desk. The numbers on the screen in front of her were blurring slightly. She breathed. She counted the columns. 17 columns. She counted the rows, started at the top. Problem? She looked up. Rask was in the doorway. He didn't usually check on her. He moved through the building on a specific logic she'd mapped in her head, there and not there, predictable if you tracked the pattern. Personal call, she said. It's handled. He looked at her for a moment, not intrusively, just taking stock of something. The Harlow Street account needs reconciliation today, he said, but not urgently. If you need an hour. She didn't need an hour, but she noted, in the margins of her own attention, that he'd offered one. I'm fine, she said. Send me the Harlow Street files. He did. 6 weeks in, she attended a dinner with him, a different kind, the performance kind, the kind that made clear why the other dinner had been such a relief. A room full of people whose handshakes meant something and whose smiles were calibrated, and she was there as his guest, which meant things that no one said directly. She wore a dress she'd bought for the wedding that she'd never worn, and she stood beside him, and she watched how people approached him, carefully, and usually from the front. No one touched him without permission. No one interrupted him when he was speaking. A man in a grey suit started to tell a story that was pointed in Rask's direction. Some reference to a deal that hadn't gone his way, Sera could tell from the shape of it, and Rask let him finish and then said something very quietly that she didn't fully catch, and the man's expression changed the way a light changes when the power goes out. On the drive back, she said, "What did you say to him?" "The grey suit. I reminded him of something he owed me," Rask said. "How much?" he told her. She whistled, low and involuntary. "And he still has that smile? He doesn't have a choice." A pause. "That's usually how it works. Is that how it works with me?" He looked at her. The car's interior was dark and she could only see part of his face. "No," he said simply. "You could leave tomorrow." She thought about that on the way home. She thought about it in the elevator, and while she was taking off her shoes in the hallway, and while the kettle was boiling. She was good at numbers, and she had been, for 6 weeks, running the numbers on this arrangement. What she owed, what he owed, what the ledger looked like, and the answer kept coming back to something she didn't entirely know how to categorize. He treated her like someone whose conclusions were worth waiting for. He hadn't once explained anything back to her incorrectly. When she'd told him about Daniel's call, he hadn't told her what to feel or offered an opinion on the situation. He'd asked if she needed an hour. Daniel had once spent 20 minutes explaining to her how compound interest worked. She poured her tea and stood in her kitchen and thought, that's not a reason to feel anything. That's just a low bar. Having a low bar cleared doesn't mean. She stopped that thought where it was. She was not, she reminded herself, here for that. The situation with Priya came to a head in a way she hadn't planned. She was leaving the office building on a Wednesday evening when she turned a corner and walked directly into Priya, standing on the pavement, looking like she'd been waiting there, which she had. Sera stopped. Priya looked terrible in the specific way of someone who hadn't been sleeping and knew they deserved it. "I've been trying to reach you," she said. "I know. Sera, please, I need you to—" "What?" Sera said. Her voice was very even. She'd had 6 weeks. "What do you need me to do?" Priya's eyes went red at the edges. "I need you to yell at me, or something. You've been completely silent and it's inconvenient for you," Sera said. "I understand. Unfortunately, I've been busy." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "We're not friends anymore, Priya. That's the whole of it. I don't have a speech. I don't have a confrontation. I have a new job and a new lock on my door and a calendar that's actually mine." Priya was crying now. Sera watched her with something that wasn't quite coldness and wasn't quite compassion, more like the feeling of looking at a number that had come out negative, accurate, just negative. Was it worth it? Sera asked, not unkindly. Actually curious, Priya shook her head. No. That's unfortunate, Sera said. She stepped around her. Take care of yourself. She walked to the parking structure. Her hands were shaking slightly, just the fingers. She stood beside her car for a moment, pressed her palm against the cold metal of the roof, and counted the levels of the structure up from where she stood. 4. She counted them back. 4. Then she got in and drove home. She told Rask about it the next morning, not because she meant to, but because he asked how she was, and she said fine and then said actually that was a lie. I ran into my former best friend last night and told her we were done, and then gave him the rest of it. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. How do you feel? He said, when she'd finished. Lighter, she said, and was surprised to find it was true. Mostly lighter. A little sad. The sad part makes sense. I knew her for 11 years. Yes, he said. Did you ever have someone betray you? She said, and immediately thought, that's too personal, don't. Several times, he said. The first time was the most instructive. What did you do? I kept better records afterward. She laughed. She didn't mean to. It just came out, real and sudden. He looked at her with that measuring expression, and something in it had changed, she thought. Or maybe she was only now able to see it clearly. It wasn't calculating. It was attentive. There was a difference. She noticed she'd been noticing that for a while. She told herself firmly that noticing was not the same as anything else. The thing that changed everything was not a dramatic moment. It was a Thursday in November, when the heat had gone out in the building because of a boiler problem, and everyone was working in coats, and Rask brought her coffee without being asked, not from the office machine, but from the place down the street, the one she usually went to alone at 9:30. He set it on her desk without a word and went back to his own office, and she sat there with the coffee and thought, he's been watching what time I leave. It was, objectively, a small thing. It sat in her chest for the rest of the day like a stone dropped into still water. The rings kept spreading. She'd run the ledger on her own feelings, she realized, with the same system she used on everything. Column A, what she'd gotten. Column B, what she owed, net balance. It was how she'd gotten through the last 6 months. It was efficient. It was safe. But the columns weren't balancing anymore. She didn't say anything. She wasn't impulsive. She had been impulsive exactly once in the last year, and it had been about Daniel, and she had the catering deposit invoice to show for it. She just kept note of it, tracked it, added to the tally. He drove her home one night when her car was in for service, which he offered because it was raining, and the offer was practical. And she sat in the passenger seat of a car she'd never been in before and noticed that it smelled like cedar and something else, something she didn't have a name for, and he drove the way he did everything else, efficiently, without wasted motion. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Why me? Actually, from the bar. She turned to look at him. He was quiet for a moment. The rain was steady against the windows. You were in pain, he said. And you were counting bottles. Most people don't do that. Most people let the pain take up all the space. He glanced at her, briefly, and back to the road. I thought that person knows how to hold 2 things at once. She turned back to the window. That's not a job qualification, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She thought about that for the rest of the drive, and while she was saying good night, and while she stood in her hallway for the second time in 6 months staring at her kettle. This time she didn't start a list. She just stood there and let the rings spread as far as they went and didn't try to calculate where they'd end. She called him the next morning. I need to tell you something, she said, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying it because I feel like I owe it to you or because the situation has made me dependent in some way that's distorted my judgment. I've actually run through both of those scenarios, and I don't think that's what's happening. A pause. All right, I think I've been paying attention to you, she said, more than is professionally appropriate. And I thought you should know because I keep better records than I used to, and I'd rather have it in the open than not. Another pause. Longer. I've been aware of that. He said I didn't want to assume it went beyond professional preference. It does, she said. Does it? For you? The silence lasted long enough that she started to count the seconds. She got to 7. "Yes," he said, "for considerably longer than I've thought was appropriate to mention." She sat down on her kitchen chair. "Okay," she said, "okay. That's useful information." "Is it? I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "I like having the numbers correct." She could hear it in his voice, the same thing she'd seen in the bar, that corner-of-the-mouth acknowledgement. "Then they're correct," he said. She went into the office that afternoon, and she sat at her desk, and she did the Harlow Street reconciliation, and 3 other things, and she didn't look up every time he moved through the building. She didn't need to track the pattern anymore. She knew where he was. She knew where she was, too. Not safe, exactly. She had been careful enough, for long enough, to know that safe was not what this was. But her hands weren't shaking. The calendar was full, not with things someone else had planned, but with things she had chosen, work she was good at, an apartment she actually liked, a life that had been assembled, piece by piece, from the wreckage of a different one. She had not been rescued. She wanted that noted. She had walked into a bar on the worst day of her year and ordered rye she didn't like and started counting bottles, and everything that came after was a consequence of that, of her own stubbornness, her own precision, her own refusal to stop adding, even when the numbers were bad. Rask knocked on her open door at 4:30. He did not often knock. "The Meridian situation is resolved," he said. "You were right about the payment logs." "I'm usually right about payment logs," she said. "Yes," he said, "you are." He stayed in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "There's dinner, Thursday, not the other kind, the first kind." She thought about the first kind. 8 people, working food, Odette asking reasonable questions. "All right," she said. He nodded and left. She turned back to her screen. The columns were balanced, everything accounted for. She scrolled to the top and started the final check, line by line, the way she always did, not because she expected to find anything wrong, but because that was the work, and the work was hers, and she did not cut corners on things that mattered. Outside the window, it was getting dark. The city was doing what cities did. Sera kept her head down and finished the numbers,